Hi, my name's Trent and I'm the Weft Wright. Welcome to my tiny fiber studio. Have you ever wanted to make a skinny scarf? They go in and out of fashion, but they're in right now. So I want to knit something on my machine that is this narrow, just around 2 inches. But the smallest river comb that I have for my machine is this wide, and that creates a lot of headaches. So stay tuned to see the solution I came up with. Welcome back. Skinny scarves like this one are incredibly popular right now as there is a revival of all things 1990s, which I personally appreciate. And so I wanted to create some skinny scarves for my shop on my knitting machine. My knitting machine is a Brother KH930. And I have a ribber for that machine. So the easiest way to make a skinny scarf that is knitted is with the ribber, because that way it doesn't curl in either direction. And I also had a stock of yarn that I got for free that was chenille. And I thought that's the perfect 1990s yarn, right? Chenille was all the rage from the 90s into the early 2000s. So I knit a bunch of these in several jewel tone colors, some wool on there. And they are a really fun accessory, not necessarily going with this shirt, but they're not mainly to keep you warm. They're mainly a fashion accessory, though they do a good job, and they're super soft and they're easy to make. I throw them in the machine to wash them and they fluff up really nicely. But trying to knit a rib that is this narrow, roughly 2 inches, was very difficult using a traditional ribber comb. So I came up with a solution that I found really useful, and I was able to crank out about a dozen of these scarves. In fact, it takes about 12 minutes to knit them, and they are incredibly long. The equipment you're going to need is, of course, your knitting machine and ribber. You're going to need some waste yarn. I just used some 3-ply Astracryl because I had some. You're going to need your 1x1 needle pusher, which comes with your machine and with your ribber. And instead of using the ribber comb, we're going to be using the edge weights. They look kind of like the number 7 or a hangman's gallows, and they are very, very efficient for weighting down narrow ribbing. I also will use 2 half-pound ribber weights for this project. The last thing you're going to need is your main yarn. And for me, that is this lovely pumpkin colored chenille yarn made in rayon that's going to put me in the spirit for the fall because I am ready for summer to be over. I purchased this at the Old Mill Yarns, which is an online website. They also have an in-person store. I can't remember where. I'll put the info down in the information box below. But this is a really fine, I would say, lace weight rayon chenille yarn that's going to be perfect for this project. Let's get started. When threading your chenille yarn through your tension mast, I like the tension to be right around the middle, so not in the tightest and not the loosest it can be. I also use wax for chenille yarn just because it's a little fuzzy. So I simply put my wax there. I thread my tension mast as usual. And then I'll also go ahead and thread up my waste yarn. I find it efficient so that I don't have to stop and get up when it's ready to cast off. I'm going to pull forward to the right of 0 all the needles using my edge weight as a needle pusher. And that's going to help determine how wide I can go. Now it looks like I'm at about 13 needles on one side, so we'll go with 13 needles on the other side. So that gives me an even number of needles, and that is my goal for the top. I'm going to use my 1x1 needle pusher to push back every other needle all the way out of work. So that gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 needles in work. Looks like I didn't get an even number, so I must have miscounted. I'm going to add one more needle on this side so that I have 14 needles in work. The reason is my particular machine doesn't like having one ribber needle on one edge and not on the other edge. I like to have both of my end needles to be on the top bed. So then I'm going to push up from the bottom. Now, I just realized my machine is in half pitch. I want it in full pitch. Then I'm going to push up my machine. I'm going to make sure that my racking handle is right in the center. Perfect. And I'm going to push up every other needle between the needles on my bed. So that means I have 14 on top. I should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 on the bottom. So I am going to run my carriage across just in standard mode. I'm going to cancel all buttons. I'm going to run it across just to line up my needles. Perfect. Now we're going to do a pretty traditional cast on for ribbing. So we're going to do what we call a circular cast on. I like to place my yarn in between my beds while the beds are closed. And then if they get stuck, I'll just blow with my mouth to get the yarn to go through. And then I'm going to clamp on a clothespin or peg, depending on where you are in the world, to the end of my yarn. Now I'm going to load up my machine. This is not a detailed instruction about how to do ribbing, but it is going to be helpful. So at this point, I'm going to turn my tension dial on my main carriage as tight as it will go, so that's several clicks below 0. I'm going to do the same on my ribber carriage and run from right to left to create a zigzag row. I think I might have my mass tension a little high because we're pulling some of my needles more than I would like. I'm going to adjust that a little bit. I haven't used this yarn before. I've been using other vintage chenille yarns. So every yarn is a little bit different. Now I'm going to take my edge weights. And I'm going to set it down on my zigzag row. They should overlap slightly in the middle. And then I'm going to add my 2 half-pound ribber weights. And I'm going to set my carriage up to 2 clicks past 0. That's my tension. I'm going to do that on the main carriage and the ribber carriage. And I'm going to set up for circular ribbing. So that's going to be to slip in one direction. I'm going to choose the right direction on the ribber and slip in the left direction on the main bed. And then do 1, 2, 3 rows. At this point, I have all my needles knitting properly, and it's time to cancel my slip functions and go up to my main tension. I think for this yarn, it is going to be at 5. This is a little thicker than the other vintage yarn I was using. I'm going to set my row counter to 0. And I'm going to knit my first row. All right, everything is knitting fine. And what I have found is this scarf is the perfect length at 700 rows. I know this sounds like a lot, and it is, but I've come up with some strategies that help me knit it effectively. First of all, every 50 rows I change arms, just so that my arm doesn't get too worn out. Now I switch arms so I don't get worn out. So at 100 is when I move my weights up. As you see, my weights are almost hitting the floor now, and you have to maintain consistent weight whenever you're doing any kind of rib. So at row 100, I simply take my weights out and move them up. Here's a close-up of moving the weights up. I'm going to take a weight, bring it between the two beds, all the way across as far as it'll go. It'll pull in the edge stitch just slightly. Do it on the other side, they'll cross. You just want to make sure you don't get behind a gate peg. Then you're ready to knit again. And when you've reached 700 rows, you're ready to cast off. I leave at least 2 feet of yarn with which to sew up later. And then I want to get that through the bed. So I will take that out of the machine and try to fumble around. As I said, sometimes blowing the yarn down in between the beds is really effective. Some people put a clothespin on this. I don't find it necessary. And now it's time to thread up our waist yarn. Once again, I'm using 3-ply Astracryl. It is usually a good idea to put a clothespin on. If not, just hold on to it with your hand. You're not going to be knitting with it for very long. So now I knit off my waist yarn in circular knitting. So I'm going to do the same things I did before. I'm going to put up my slip on the right side of my ribber and push in the slip button on the left side of my main bed, and then knit 16 rows. That'll give me 8 total rows on each side because we're slipping in one direction with each pass. Notice that on the first pass, it only knitted on the bottom. The second pass only knits on the top. And we're going to do that for 16 rows. And now it's time to take the work off the machine. I'm going to break my waste yarn, pull it down through the beds, and I'm going to make sure there's still some weight on the piece and knit off half and knit off the other half, and we're free. So now it's time to bind off the ribbing. What we have is our waste yarn, and we should have the tail of the waste yarn on the right hand side if you're right handed, the end of your waste yarn, and the end of your main yarn. So I'm going to thread up with a tapestry needle my main yarn. At this point, it is sometimes helpful to cut these waste yarn pieces a little bit shorter because they can be very annoying. But I'm going to open up and we're going to see all of the stitches. I'm going to poke my yarn through. And then essentially what we're going to be doing is a Kitchener stitch. We're going to be going through a bottom yarn from the inside, through a bottom yarn up into the middle, and crossing over on the other side and doing the opposite. Going to go up and down. So that's going to make a little frowny face with your yarn. Then we're going to reuse the same hole that we had just used on the bottom. So I'm going to go down into that stitch and up into the next stitch and pull that where it's snug but not tight. Then I'm going to go up into the last stitch that I used on the top side. It's right there. And down through the next stitch. And down and up. So you can think about this like the doo-doo stitch, right? Down, up, down, up. So I'm going to go up and down, down, and up. There are plenty of great ways to do a bind off for your ribbing, but I find the sewn bind off with waste yarn to be the most easy for me to figure out and gives me a really nice finish that doesn't look out of place. Some bind offs leave a very distinct edge, and I want this bind off to look exactly like the cast on, and that's what is great about this particular sewn bind off. This is where it would have been nice to trim those extra threads. They always seem to get in the way. There are lots of great knitting machine related videos on YouTube. I particularly like Diane Sullivan. She has some really great up-close videos about how to do this sewn bind off. I'll link to some of her videos and also some other YouTubers who I love in the realm of machine knitting. I learned all of my machine knitting skills from YouTube. I call it YouTube University. I will say on the very edges, the stitches can be a little tighter and harder to see. The important thing is that you go through every stitch. If you don't get the perfect down, up, up, down, you're going to be all right. But if you don't catch every stitch, your knitting will unravel. I think that is all of them. I'm going to check to make sure there are no stitches that weren't used. And now I'm going to poke my thread through to the other side, and I'm going to weave in this tail. Now, there are very proper and appropriate ways to weave in when you are finishing the ends of a knitting yarn. A lot of those includes mimicking the stitch pattern of the knitting, but with this textured chenille yarn, you literally cannot see anything. So I just whip stitch up one edge, and when we wash it in the machine, it will totally disappear. Sometimes it leaves a little skinny thread that you have to trim away, but I find this so much quicker, and I've had no issues with it hiding and looking perfectly fine. If you are doing this in a different type of yarn, you may want to weave in your ends a little differently, but with the chenille, there's no problem. Now I, for double security, like to whip back down a few stitches. I'm just going to break my yarn. I don't have scissors handy. And then we're going to unravel our waist yarn. Where is the end of my waist yarn? There it is. Pull it out. Got a nice finish that matches the finish on the other side. I almost forgot to mention that you do need to weave in the end of your cast on as well, and I do that in the exact same way. I thread my needle, and then I do a simple whip stitch along the edge. As mentioned before, if you're doing this in a not fuzzy textured yarn, you may want to weave in a duplicate stitch, just because both sides of this scarf are seen. There are also countless other ways of weaving in, but as I said, for this particular yarn, you will not see this whip stitch up the edge. Now, you will notice that this is a very open knit. And that's on purpose. I'm going to wash this in the washing machine in hot water for a normal cycle and then throw it in the dryer. And this rayon is going to shrink a whole bunch. And that's going to give me the perfect texture. You need to experiment and do swatches of the yarn that you're planning on using. But whatever it is, I hope it's one that you can wash in the washer and dryer, because it's where you get the fluffiest, best feeling scarf that you can possibly get. Hand washing and line drying just doesn't cut it. Now I'm going to wash this in a standard washing machine on hot water with a load of towels. When I made 12 of these scarves, I washed them all together in their own separate load, and I have some advice. If you're watching multiple of these, they will tangle together like a multi-headed hydra. So I've decided I'm going to try using a laundry bag to wash this time and see if I get the same perfectly fluffy and soft results. I will report back if you really need to wash it outside of a bag. All right, it's out of the washer and dryer, dried on hot, and it worked really well in the garment bag. The only thing I will say is it's a little wrinkled in places where it normally isn't when I just dry it without the laundry bag. So might need to hit it with a little steam iron just to iron it out. But it ended up about 8 feet long, which is a great length for wrapping around the neck multiple times. And this one's a little bit wider than some of the past ones I've made. It's about 2.5 inches wide. And it is very comfy and cozy and the perfect fall color. So I'm really excited about this. I hope you are. This is a really great project to try out if you're just learning how to use the ribber on your knitting machine and are concerned about figuring out how to use the comb. Because when I try to use the comb on such a narrow project, I can never get it balanced right, and it wants to tilt one way or the other and just wasn't working. So I think that this method is a really great solution to the problem of knitting skinny. If you don't have a knitting machine or don't feel like knitting one yourself but would like one, you can visit my website, theweftwright.com. I am selling these scarves at a very reasonable price. You can check that out on my website. I'm also selling shorter versions of it that I'm calling the skinny minis. But once again, there's no obligation to buy anything. I just want to share my videos with you, my fellow fiber artists. So until next week, keep on crafting.